Okay, so it's 4:10. Just before I get started, can everyone hear me? I'm not used to just standing here. I kind of like to walk around when I do presentations, but we're split. And maybe if I were a qubit or something like that, I could split myself and exist in two different areas at once, but I'm not, so I think I'm going to stay up here. My name is Lindsay Richman. I work for McKinsey, and principally I work for McKinsey Academy, so learning is a huge part of what I do. I've been programming now for almost 2 years, and I picked up Python as my first language. Shortly after that, I started working with Plotly because it has a lot of language support and really good documentation. And I also started working within Jupyter because it's also highly accessible. Anaconda, awesome package manager. And so when put together, both of these tools I think are fantastic. They offer a lot of language support, great documentation. More and more widgets are being created every day. This example, which we'll come back to, is a widget that allows you to use a lot of the drag and drop components of Plotly, Chart Studio directly within JupyterLab, which is awesome. So just to get started, I'm also a humanities major, so my background is actually in linguistics and art history. And so for me, it's a little strange sometimes working in this environment. I'm not a physics major, for example, and I often think, how can I make a contribution when I'm not always like everybody else? I think it's really important because when we often talk about diversity, we often talk about things like gender, someone's background, but also I think we need to think about diversity of perspective and diversity of contribution. I also think that data is something that should be used to empower humans, and that's sort of why I like doing what I do with data visualization. I think a lot of the solutions that we can develop and what we can communicate with data visualization can really be used to empower people. But, of course, technology does not always work that way. About 2 weeks ago, maybe a little more than that, a large botnet was actually uncovered on Twitter by a security company. And this dealt with cryptocurrency, an area where I've been a hobbyist for a few months now. And here's some facts about this botnet, which was a massive amount of bots. Basically, the company, Duo Security, used classic machine learning methods. They trained a bot classifier, and this is how they found out about it. Their best model had about 98% accuracy, so they looked to see who were the bot accounts, who were the human accounts. They built a really good model. What they found was that there were at least 15,000 bots active in this botnet, so it was massive. And this was on Twitter, and I'll show you in a moment in the next slide what exactly these bots were doing. And the botnet accounts actually amplified their posts through retweeting. So not only were individual bots within this botnet tweeting, but they were actually retweeting each other's posts. So they were amplifying each other and really working as a network. So what exactly did these bots do? Well, if you're active in the cryptocurrency space and you're on Twitter, you've probably seen something that looks like this before. I've seen this many, many times. These are posts that will come anytime a company or a foundation will post. For example, it could be something like the Ethereum Foundation or the Kin Foundation. You'll get a slew of these messages, and they all look pretty similar. And they basically all follow the same format. They start out with a little blurb congratulating or basically flattering you, and they always have some sort of superlative. So if you're not a fastest follower, you're like a most beautiful follower or an awesome follower in some way. And then what they do is that it's a phishing scheme. They ask you to send them some ETH, and they're going to give you some more ETH back. And they usually use Ethereum for whatever reason, maybe because so many people trade with it. So they also ask you to fave this tweet when you get yours. So they're actually asking you to sort of participate in their botnet as well. Sometimes they'll also decrement, so they'll use techniques that are used in flash sales. So they'll say, okay, I only have 30 ETH now and 20, and you better get it fast. But these things are really pervasive. And when I first started looking at them and talking with people on Twitter, we thought that these were just people that were spamming over and over again. But what was uncovered a few weeks ago was, in fact, this was a massive botnet. Interestingly, there's not a lot of variance in these posts, and at this point with the technology, it's pretty hard to create something novel this many times. But as we have improvements, and as AI gets much, much better at creating natural language at scale and putting variance in that sounds natural, it's going to get a lot harder to detect this sort of thing. So why is this important? Well, rumors like these and general techniques like these have been used to inflate markets for a long time, and cryptocurrency is one of the ones that this has been very successful in, particularly with social media. So just a few weeks ago, this is another example of a token, OX protocol, surging 20% on Coinbase rumors. So again, through social media, these rumors come up and people just start buying. Last year, towards the end of the year, when the cryptocurrency market was really hot, someone noticed that code in a coin called Tron's Codebase allegedly included Coinbase references, and they put this on Reddit. And this was actually really significant because Reddit has been a very powerful tool in conveying information, and often this information is entirely true. For example, they're now predicted to spoil every beat of Season 8. As you know, with their drones, they spoiled Season 7 of Game of Thrones. They gave us R plus L equals J. They gave us William is the Man in Black. So Reddit users have been right a lot. And that's what's interesting. When somebody posts a rumor about Coinbase and Tron on Reddit, eventually somebody will debunk it, but it can go viral pretty quickly. And people actually take Reddit as a very credible source. I've actually, as a Game of Thrones fan too, I've seen some pretty wild spoilers actually get a little bit of traction and attention for a finite amount of time, even though there's no way they could be true. But because it's on Reddit, someone will listen for a little while. So this is the code that was being posted. And this is interesting. And you can see that there's Coinbase here. But what was weird to me about this, and this is probably not very weird to people in this room, but imagine that you couldn't read this at all. You see the word Coinbase and you think, oh, like this means Coinbase, the company. And just to clarify quickly, Coinbase is a company that allows you to exchange cryptocurrency for fiat. They're a tech unicorn with a very high valuation. So this is, everyone thought this was a company, and that this meant that Tron's price would inflate and be worth a lot. But as you can see, especially in the bottom line, this looks like any other object that's being passed through a function of some sort. And so that's what to me was a little strange, because as you know, or most of you probably know, we could name this anything we wanted. So I was extremely suspicious that this is what people were saying that it was, but this got a lot of traction on forums like Twitter and another forum, Stock Tweets, which is basically a Twitter for people who trade. So I did some research, and no, Coinbase does not mean Coinbase the company. Well, what is it? It's actually a special field used as a sole input for Coinbase transactions. So this is actually part of the technical process that happens during the blockchain when there's a block reward. So this is, in fact, has nothing to do with Coinbase the company. Coinbase the company actually got their name from this and is a fantastic name, but again, this was, in fact, a built-in method. It was basically written into the code already. You can know from reading the code, another question that you could have asked was, well, why not Binance or any of these other exchanges or Bittrex? Why only Coinbase? But again, for people who really didn't read code, they saw the word Coinbase, and this became a very big rumor. So let's take a look at a financial chart. And this is Plotly, by the way, and I promise I will get to this. So this is a chart that shows you from December 2017 what happened. There was a bit of a spike towards the end of the month, and that's where I was when I started seeing this rumor. And then you can see a massive spike and very, very sharp descent in January. So a classic case of buying the rumor and selling the news. Now, this rumor alone didn't necessarily cause all of this buying and selling, but this was part of a much bigger problem that happened, and a lot of people lost a lot of money because of things like this. I actually think that this was pretty innocent. Some of them are not. The example of the botnet was clearly planned ahead of time by probably more than one person. But this does show, to me, this really showed how powerful it was to be able to work with code and understand technology a bit more deeply. Without being able to read code or know anything about it, I could have just read Coinbase and just retweeted the tweet and been part of a rumor that wasn't true. And I didn't want to do that. I did try to retweet as much as I could, but it looks like it didn't work. And then I thought to myself, if only I'd had a botnet, I could have amplified my message and maybe I could have saved people some money, but, well, I'm working on that. So. We just talked a little bit about variables and objects, and here's another variable. Before I go into the main talk, this comes from a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel, which I really like. And one of the main premises of this is that depending on the tools and the assets that you have available to you, that can radically change how fast you work and also radically change the trajectory of the success that you might have and how fast you'll innovate. And I think that this is an important premise to keep in mind when we select tools and technology. One of the main premises that the author had was that beasts of burden, for people who had beasts of burden, they replaced a handheld cart. Not all civilizations or people had beasts of burden, and there are some places that are isolated now where they're still not used, and they just have pigs, for example. So animals that you could use for sustenance, but not that you could use to pull a cart or actually take some of your handheld work away from you. So what I really like about the technology and the tools I'm about to show you is I think that they're really kind of like, if you had a handheld cart, they could become a beast of burden for you. They're things that work really well, and I think that they work quickly, and they were designed to do that. So again, thinking back to this analogy, I think that it's really important when we innovate and we want to work rapidly, but we want to do a good job, to think about the tools available to us. It's also very easy sometimes to get very focused on what we have in front of us and optimizing that. For example, if you're really attached to your handheld cart, you might just stay and work on optimizing it, trying to make it go faster or carry more weight, and not even realize that somebody next to you has a horse that's pulling a carriage that's way bigger and way faster, and then frees that person up to do something else. All right. So key features of JupyterLab. I won't spend too much time on this because we are at JupyterCon. I think some people are probably already pretty familiar with JupyterLab, so I'll just highlight the features that I like and that I think work really well with Plotly and Dash. The first is that you have many kernels and features, but only one browser tab. So your classic notebook view just looks like this, which is very nice. But if you're like me and you're new and you rely heavily on documentation, you may find yourself with a ton of these tabs. I also get really fascinated by the code, so I would end up with a lot of untitled tabs. So I'd have a lot that looked like this. They had no title because I would just jump right in, I'd forget the title, and then I'd end up with like 50 untitled notebooks, and I had no idea what was in my notebook. I didn't know it was there. This is really nice because it kind of gives you a much more integrated screen for doing work. You can have multiple kernels and multiple tabs for working in one screen. You can also put other things in a console. I also like that your files are on the left-hand side. You can right-click on the files and name them, so I've tried to be good about not having a ton of untitled tabs and naming them as I go along. But it's just a lot easier to do work with a lot of different things. The second thing I really like is, of course, a lot of useful extensions and widgets, a topic that's been covered probably a lot these last 2 days. So this, from my first slide, is a demonstration of Plotly's widget for the Plotly editor. And this is actually very easy to import. You put in a bit of Python code, and this allows you to work with data such as CSV files. You do need to use Python to actually load the data frame, but once you do that, you can actually do all of your work with a drag and drop interface. It's very cool. So this gives you a lot of the flexibility that you'd have in Chart Studio. Again, you can just click and drag, and you can even add things like a z-axis to do things in 3 dimensions. So this is a very, very cool widget, and just one example of the many widgets that are available in Jupyter. If you want to try JupyterLab, it's easy. You can just create a virtual instance of it. So you can just click on this button. I won't do that because this is one of the few things that actually does not work in slides.com. But you can open this up. It will generate some starter files for you, and you can actually explore just by clicking. So now let's get to Plotly and see how it works with JupyterLab. The first thing is it has really rich documentation for Jupyter Notebooks and Lab. So here's an example, what you have here. And as you can see, you have the core libraries up at the top. These 4 have the most stuff available and the most features, but you also have some other languages down here that I'm sure some people in this room use, such as MATLAB, Julia. So let's just take a look at R's API. And you have a wide variety of charts available. So let's just go to one we're going to look at later, time series. And you can see that there's a lot of documentation on how to do things differently. If we take a look at Python, we have really good support for Python. So I'll go to Boxplots. And this is a really nice feature here that many of the different elements have, not all of them, but many. I'm also not going to do this because this is the other thing that doesn't work in slides.com interactively. But what you can do is you can actually, in many cases, download the notebook directly from the documentation. You can download it, upload it to JupyterLab, which is really nice, and then the file simply appears on the left-hand side of your screen. This allows you to actually work directly with their code, test it out. The code is extremely portable, something we'll talk about in just a few minutes as another feature I like. So it's extremely easy to reuse different parts of the code, and this can get you started really, really quickly. But again, I think what's great is that you have a lot of documentation on many different chart types for many different industries, and in many cases, you can just simply click download the notebook, upload it, and then you can start playing with the code right away. Second one, Plotly objects are basically, and charts are based around two objects, data and layout. So let's first take a look at a chart. Okay, so here you can see we have a lot of functionality here. I'm going to zoom and show you a drop-down menu. We'll take a closer look at this a little bit later as well. Here we can actually edit it by the months and time frames, and if we want to go take a look at something else, we can. So this shows you all of these different views. So a lot of versatility. I mean, this is a pretty basic chart, but already you have a lot of versatility with it. It's very easy to make. So if you take a look at the code here, you can see the data and layout objects. Data objects can be created directly, or you can pass objects into them. So in a lot of the code that you'll see in the documentation, you'll see things like trace. This works very well with Plotly's, with Chart Studio as well, their drag and drop editor, because things are usually phrased in trace when you go to that UI. So in this case, you see trace 6. Obviously, there were 4 other traces before that. And so trace 6 is here. And then you see layout. So here you have a lot of the data, and then basic editing that can change the way that the data looks. But most of what you do in terms of the style will actually go into the layout part. And this gets very, very easy when you start practicing. It's very intuitive. So you never have to worry about a lot of different elements. You always pretty much know that there's data, layout, and just a couple of other pieces of code to get the visualization going. Finally, and third, reusable components are absolutely one of the most interesting things about this. Little pokey. Okay, it's the iframe. Great. So we have components in this chart, range slider and range selector. I'll go back to this chart after showing the code. Here's our range slider down here. So I can actually use this to slide and zoom in. And here I have some data. This is also a very nice feature too. But again, if I want to isolate some particular dates and look a bit more closely, I can use this. I can also go up here, this is also nice, and reset the axes. So this gives me a very fast way of going back. Up here, I have my range selector. So if I want to just isolate the last few months, this doesn't have too much data, I think. I can do it that way too. And anytime I want to set everything back, I can click on either reset axes or auto scale to take things home. So here you actually can see that the range slider starts at a certain place because there's just not too much data in this case. So what does this look like in terms of the code? This is pretty easy. Here I have the range slider. I don't think there was quite enough space to do all of it, but the range slider is actually really, really easy. Auto range true. You can put it under the x-axis because that's where it goes, and it's really, really simple. I mean, you pretty much just put it in, and that's what you get. There are different ways of customizing it, of course, but in a lot of cases, you're not going to need a lot of customization. The base form of this that will be in the documentation will work just fine for you. So there are definitely ways to add more elements to this. As you can see, this is very, very basic, but you can certainly do more with it if necessary. This also follows a similar format with the code. So it's also not hard to just grab one of these from some of the documentation, put them on top. Again, this probably isn't the best example because it doesn't really go back too much, but if I did want to look at 3 months or 1 month, this can radically change the view that I have when I look at the data. So this looks pretty flat here, for example. There's not too much movement, although I guess there's still somewhat. But here you can see that there's a lot more, there's a much bigger high and low when looking over the longer term data. So this gives you an easy way to get different views, and it's very, very easy to do. Okay, so I had to have a cat slide in order to make this truly a presentation today. One of the coolest parts of these charts, and there are many of them, is they can also become components within Dash apps. So one of the ways I look at this is basically almost like a Russian doll, where you could have at the very bottom something like a drop-down menu or a range slider, like we just looked at. Then you could actually have the actual Plotly chart itself, which could be a candlestick chart, it could be a bar chart. There's many different options. And then at the very top, in the biggest form, is the Dash app or web app. And so we'll take a look at a Dash app that I made and deployed on Heroku, and I'll show you how you can use that and then put the components of Plotly and their charts into a Dash app to create something really different. Because sometimes, for me, I feel like I let a lot of this stuff stay within my notebook a little too much. And for me, the notebook is often a very experimental environment. I'm not always sure that I want to publish them, or I mean to, but then, I really need to clean my code up and I don't. So being able to transform this, especially into visualization, into something where I can really communicate, that's really important. And I think Dash is a really good framework for doing that. Before I get started, I do want to say that Dash was specifically designed to work very quickly. It was designed so you can create web apps in pure Python. Prior to that, you really needed to use things like D3 in addition to Python. So this allows you to work in one language and write a lot less code. It's much faster for most people. I'm guessing, since this is a data-centric conference, that there are far more Python programmers than JavaScript programmers here. That's just a guess. But it is kind of nice to work in one language. In addition, if you do work in JavaScript, you probably know that just the term JavaScript itself is a bit of a misnomer, and that you could be working with vanilla JavaScript, but it could also be something like React, where the syntax is pretty different. In addition, there are tons of packages that seem to come out pretty much every week, and it's extremely hard to keep up. So while it's extremely versatile as a language, I think that versatility also has challenges too, in that even though you can do a lot with it, there's just a lot you can do with it, a lot of different packages and different flavors. And so just being able to work in Python, there's something, in my opinion, really comforting about that. So here's a picture of my Jupyter lab, and this is an example of a chart. I've cleaned it up quite a bit since then. I told you that my notebooks were like a messy environment, so this chart looks a little messy too. And so this is a chart, and you can see the code up here and all the elements. It has a drop-down menu on the left, and then it has several different lines for several different cryptocurrency tokens. And when I put it into the Dash app, which I will show in a few slides, this is what it looks like. So again, I cleaned it up because this is like the real thing where I'm actually wanting to show this to people. And it has all the same elements. There was a little bit of editing required to get the syntax to work with Dash, but not that much. I pretty much could just put it in, do some light editing, and then basically reuse everything that I had done in Jupyter Labs and my notebook. Okay, it's slow. We're waiting on Heroku. While we wait, let's go to this slide first. This app is a prototype, so it's meant to serve as a representation of an actual project. The data was only pulled from a free mini API, so it's a small sample. If I wanted more data, I'd have to pay. So this just made sense for a prototype. I only use time series analysis with supervised machine learning, so you really would have to use additional techniques like sentiment analysis if you wanted to do anything to predict any sort of pricing in this environment. And this primarily serves as a boilerplate to showcase the versatility of Plotly and Dash. So again, I'm going to show you something that looks, it's supposed to be a business intelligence report, and it is, but it's also a prototype, so I just want to clarify that. I really would need more data, and I'd need to go a lot deeper in order to do something that I would deliver to someone. Oh, come back. Okay, good. So this is the app that I made. This is a web app. I'll quickly show you some features because we'll come back to it. You can scroll through, and it's very compact. And all of these charts are charts that I either created or could have created in JupyterLab. Again, a great environment for prototyping. I also pulled the data for the API in to Jupyter Notebook because there was a lot of documentation available. So again, I could leverage all the documentation that was available in the open source community, experiment, get an idea of what charts I wanted to use, make sure everything ran correctly, and then sort of port it into a more, a more permanent environment. And you do have a lot of features with these charts as well. This one, because I may forget to come back to it. For example, this box plot, I kind of ran out of space, so I just put this here again to show a different chart type. But on the first page, I write a little bit about this and about the upper bounds of the pricing that NEO has had. But on the other hand, it might be better just to show something like this to convey the information. Also, I'm sure I'm going to forget to say this, so I'll say it now. You can also print this to a PDF, which is really cool. I actually did it. I printed it at my work. So again, you will lose a lot of the interactivity of the Dash charts, obviously, if you save or print this to a PDF, but it still gives you a really nice report, and you can actually save views in customized ways. So if somebody wanted to see something specific within your data, you could actually just isolate that and then print the PDF out with that specific view. So again, it gives you a lot of versatility. So just to refresh, this is a prototype. Great, that came up quickly. So this was actually forked from a Vanguard report that is in Dash's repository. Just like Jupyter Notebooks and Plotly, Dash has a lot of documentation available online, and there are more and more Dash apps being created and put up for documentation all the time. So you can see here that this is, this pretty much follows a very similar format. You have some of the elements of these charts. Given what it is, it's a lot more heavy in analysis and also in, what would be a pandas data frame, but just looks like a financial chart here. So this is the original. So what did I do to change it? I made light edits to the CSS to change the color format and branding. The one that I made deals with tokens for a blockchain called Neo. So their colors are green and black, and so I changed it from red to green just to make it look better. The CSS is largely based on Bootstrap, so it's very intuitive and very easy to work with. And the CSS was also linked externally on CodePen, so I just forked that and was able to make the changes. And then I just linked the new file. Much of the HTML was converted to Markdown for easier styling of text elements. The original had a lot of just HTML, but it's a lot easier in Dash to work with Markdown if you want to deal with font weights, for example. So I really wanted to emphasize a lot in this and put it in bold or italics. And I had a lot of, I basically wanted to do a lot of unordered lists and ordered lists because I had a lot of information that I wanted to convey in a very succinct format. So for me, Markdown was a lot easier. So a lot of the original HTML was replaced by Markdown, which is a Dash core component and very easy to work with. I put in some new chart types, which included candlestick, Boxplot, and filled area. So almost all of the charts that you have in Plotly can actually be put in Dash apps as well. Some of them require a little bit more massaging of the code than others, but most are pretty easy to get in and intuitive to figure out. And also, again, there's a lot of documentation, so you can build off of other people's work. Finally, these charts have new components. The drop-down menu and the range slider, for example, are two things that were not previously in the other app from Vanguard that I put in because I find them very interesting. Another thing to think about is as we put more data into these, and these can actually hold quite a bit of data, especially with innovations in the space like Data Reader and widgets like that, is that we're going to have ways to filter this data, even within something like a report like this. So a drop-down menu or a range slider becomes very, very important, and eventually a text box where you could search for something, that might become important too. So there's ways to filter your data, and you can get it all in. All right, so here we're back to the Dash app. And we can take a look at some of these components here. So up here, I just put in some text. I basically used an unordered list. I bolded some of the key elements that I wanted to talk about. And then we can use our range slider down here to isolate this. And then I can also zoom in. So if I want to zoom in, you can actually see that they are, in fact, candlesticks. So you get an idea of the open, the high, the low, and the close. So when I pulled the data from the API, this was a lot of the data that I got. This is really, really nice. I may have a code example in here. If not, I'll publish it. But it's nice to just be able to pull in this data from the API and basically get all of it rendering here in a very compact chart. So this was very easy to make. Moving along here, I go more into the various tokens in these ecosystems. So I almost feel like I should have explained what this was, but the focus really is on the charts. So here, these are several different businesses that are used within Neo's blockchain. So they're decentralized apps, and they're pretty representative of what you might have in another blockchain like Ethereum. So the one I took the biggest look at is AlphaCat, and that's robo-trading and financial advisory. We also have Deep Brain Chain, which is AI, Ontology, which provides off-chain scaling solutions, very important on a blockchain. And finally, Trinity, which basically offers private services for basically for your identity verification. So another thing that's very important. This particular chart combines data, highs and lows, from all four of these tokens that we're looking at. You can also put a link, by the way, up here if you want to cite a source. So that's very nice. So this one works a little differently. I can actually highlight this way. And this gives me a much closer view of what I'm looking at. The reason I chose, and you could do this many different ways, but the reason I like to keep the high and the low in two lines here was because I could kind of see the difference in the spread. And I really liked seeing that. Again, I can reset my axis, and I can go back here. And I can take a look at something else. And again, focus in on it. And really drill down very deeply into this data. Here's another example. It's just really, really interesting to look at. And if I want to go back, I have to reset my axes because these are on pretty different scales. So it's pretty amazing to look at. If you look, you can see that ontology has, cost far more than all of these other tokens down here. Another thing you can do, and again, as you get, if you pass more objects in, this gets complicated because, again, you're getting like all of these different lines that represent something. But if you don't have that many, you can rely on this feature here, where you can actually isolate the data. If you click here, this takes this away. And now you can actually see this in a very, very different view. So with ontology out of the way, which was on a very different scale, this now auto-scales and shows you all the data for everything else. So it's a lot more easier now to see the other three tokens, although we can see AlphaCat is still sort of pittering at the bottom. So let me take these other ones out. Deep Brain Chain, Trinity, and here we are with AlphaCat. So another nice feature is that this does auto-scale. So if you have data that's on really different scales, it's not a problem. You can just isolate your different objects either this way on the side, or you can use a drop-down menu. Again, if I want to go home, I just reset my axes. Oh, do I really have to do that? I bet there's a better way to do that. It's nice because this panel up here allows you to very quickly move between the different panels. I don't have to open up another tab or wait for anything to load very quickly. It's very lightweight. So these two charts here show volume and fluctuation. What's really cool about these is that you can immediately sort of see a correlation between the two. The volume is just how much of the trading is going on for a specific token. The fluctuation is basically the difference between the high and the low price on a given day. And if you look at this, we can see that these look kind of similar. At least we know that for ontology. Let's take that out and take a look at the other three a bit more closely. Oops. Yeah, I mean, to me, these look, again, you'd have to drill down into the data, but these look remarkably similar despite being different data points that were calculated differently. So this is a very interesting insight you can get from seeing these side by side. And if I want to drill down more, let me go back to, let me actually take advantage of this drop down here. I'll go to AlphaCat specifically. And now, if you look at this, you can really see how similar these are. Again, I promise you, it's different data, but these are really similar. So it looks like there's a really high correlation between these two things. These are low-volume tokens. They're small, and not many people know about them. So not many people trade, and so it's not surprising you'd see something like this, honestly, because anytime that the volume goes up a lot, that generally means that somebody has come out of the woodwork, hopefully people and not a botnet, to increase the prices or to buy. So looking at this as somebody who knows quite a bit about this token, I can actually tell you what this was. This here was actually caused by an announcement. Let's zoom in on this too. Yeah, remarkably similar. This was actually caused by an announcement that the company made that if you purchase 1 million of their tokens, which actually is not as much as you think, and you hold them, you actually get free business insights. So you get predictions on prices for things like Bitcoin or EOS or Ethereum or other tokens. So you can see here that people bought, but then once you started getting the report on a daily basis, it wasn't clear whether you had to hold the tokens or not. So people subsequently probably chose to sell. So I'll reset the axis for this. And let's take a look at this month. Not much has been going on. So not too much has been going on this month. It was remarkably quiet for a while. Again, these look like pretty similar charts. What I think this was probably caused by was the release of some tokens. Some investors had actually been holding tokens for a while, and they were eventually released to the public, which means they ended up on auction houses. This drove the price down. Obviously, there were some other factors that caused the overall market to drop too, but this spike was probably largely caused, at least in part, by the fact that the circulation of the tokens increased. So what I find fascinating about this is, as somebody who sort of knows quite a bit about this token, I can actually tell that from just looking at these charts, I have a pretty good idea of what happened during this time. And the interesting thing is there's a lot of quiet going on, except for these really big points up here that usually correlate to some sort of big news announcement. So it could be the release of a main net or product. It could be, an increase in coins or a coin burn that would decrease the supply of tokens. It could also be that, a report that, this actually doesn't work the way it's supposed to. Or it could be positive news about a partnership, maybe with a major venture fund or a company like Nike. So these types of things tend to cause a high spike. Again, this is where I wish I'd had time to do a sentiment analysis on Twitter, because I think there'd be a lot of insights to glean from that. Of course, given that there is that huge botnet, I think we also have to be very careful about that. Here, I just put a little bit of information about a forecasting approach you can use. So again, this is not developed, this is a prototype, so there's a lot more work that needs to be done on this. But you could use an algorithm like a support vector machine, for example, and use that with time series forecasting to take a look to see what the weights of the different features might be, and if they're important or not. So the interesting thing that I found with both of these, I only did AlphaCat and Ontology for this, but in both cases, there was a really high a lot of weight was given to the closing price in a given day, which was interesting because there's actually some other articles that have been published. I put a link to one of them in the last tab of this report that actually show very similar numbers when looking at Ethereum closing prices. So this is very interesting. I'm not really sure why, but my feeling is that these are generally pretty steady unless there's one of these huge news announcements. And those news announcements tend to only come once every few weeks. So on a daily basis, you know, it's probably using time series analysis can get you pretty far, but then you have these massive spikes. And to go back and just to show you again, if we look at the daily fluctuation in something like AlphaCat, you end up having these massive spikes at certain intervals, and that's when a lot of times the news hits. And when I think combining this with something like sentiment analysis could be a very powerful tool. All right, so here we just have a bit of a summary. Again, I use Markdown to do all the writing, and if you're interested to, there's a link to the article that actually had very similar results using a similar methodology to what I used for this. But again, it sort of just gives a bit of a summary about the information that you have. So again, if you were to write a business report or any kind of report for someone, even a scientific paper, you could put your summary here. And for me, one of the biggest things I think that's important that we often don't do enough when we do analysis is some kind of call to action. Oftentimes, I do this. There's analysis, for example, like something sits in my Jupyter notebook, and it doesn't really go anywhere, and it's not really used for anything. So in this case, looking at some of the features of this, you know, you have these really high spikes in volume and rapid price fluctuations that can often happen in an hour or less. That's really hard for a human being to do. We know there are bots in the space already. You know, we know that trading volume tends to be low in comparison to higher volume tokens. And then we also know that daily prices are highly correlated with the previous day's closing prices. One action that I would recommend from this, again, as more of a hobbyist, is just to build a trading bot. They're already very much in the system, so I think it's good to participate in that. There are also a lot of open source repositories where people are building bots, primarily in Python, actually. So you could keep continuing to work in Python, you know, up from Plotly to Dash to a bot. And a lot of these actually have very active communities on Slack and you know, GitHub repositories where people are contributing a lot of new features and bug fixes. So you have a lot of very active people in this community who can help make these things. But again, like to me, it was really fascinating looking at this because coming into this space, I had no idea that I figured it was humans, honestly. You know, it just seemed like they were humans who were doing very, very small granular tasks, which should have been a tip-off, but in fact, you know, in very incremental things. But in fact, looking back at, you know, when I would place a price in an auction house, it's kind of obvious to me now that this probably was a bot doing it and not a person. So again, just to give an overall idea of this, something like this could be used. I mean, this is really just a shell. This could be used for many, many different things, you know, and research. You know, even just something that a newsletter. So it's really more of a communication piece than anything else. And the cool thing is that you can easily combine qualitative analysis in the text with something that allows you to really drill down into the quantitative data a bit more with the charts. All right. Let's look a little bit at the code. So how would you make this? So this is actually really not that different than Plotly's code at all. And the syntax was largely unchanged. You'll notice if you look that you'll see the dcc.graph. DCC stands for Dash Core Components. So Dash's core components, they have that, they begin with that. So you'll see DCC, but underneath that, when you go down to figure, you'll see one of our familiar friends, data, and then you'll see go scatter for a scatter chart. In this case, this is a line graph, and that's also used to make line graphs. And then you can also see underneath it all of the different attributes that are within this. So again, everything is sort of built around data and layout again. It's just wrapped a little bit differently. There are also a few different ways to do this within Dash in terms of the syntax. So this is just one example that I'm showing, but it's pretty effective. Here you can see up here the HTML. So you have the, for H6, you have that header, you have the class name. The class name actually brings in the green panel that you see, so that comes in from the CSS. Then you have a break, and then you have your paragraph. So using the chart below to explore the data. So it's very intuitive, and I'd say that this particular example of the Vanguard report was extremely easy to read. So again, even for someone who's just doing this and is pretty new at programming, I found this very, very intuitive to put together because of the documentation. If we dig a little deeper into this, we can see a combination now of the Markdown and the HTML. So here we have just the HTML, and this was from the original report. And then here's where I put Markdown in, because I found it a lot easier to, again, bold things and put things into bullet points. So here we have the Markdown. You can see with the double stars, I put something in for Neo, and it comes out in bold. So again, this allows you to do a lot of textual editing really, really quickly and effectively. In HTML, I found it was way harder to do it. So I ended up just taking out all of the HTML tags, which were basically tagged to P for paragraph, and I replaced them with the dash core component, the Markdown component. So we've also taken a look at that. All right. So for more info, you can go to Plotly webinars, and they have a lot of different webinars available. Most of these, to be honest, are about Dash at this point. So for example, if you want to do machine learning or computer vision with Dash, you can do that. You can learn how to connect a data source to Dash. So again, these are all webinars that have been recorded, and there are live webinars that come out once or twice a month. So really awesome. Not only do you have this great code base and community online, but you also have these webinars that are very helpful that you can do on demand. And I believe we're out of time. That was really fast, sorry. In my head, I was thinking 5 o'clock. So I want to just thank everybody for supporting me, Women in Machine Learning and Data Science for the scholarships to attend Plotly, and last year's JupyterCon, Plotly for sponsoring me at their workshop so I could actually learn Plotly and Dash, Udacity for their scholarships, McKinsey Academy for their support in my learning, and finally, everybody in this room for being here and supporting me through your attendance. So thank you.